Please remember none of this is financial advice, and this channel is sponsored by the XX Network. Elegance is not a dispensable luxury, but a factor that decides between success and failure.
Well, cross-border payments are definitely going to change and have a wholly different model. I believe SWIFT still has a role to play there, but not in the services they're providing now, which is a messaging layer that supports the corresponding banking regime that we have today. We're going to see a fundamentally different future, which will be real-time and much less expensive as we see currencies move across borders and into other currencies.
With the ability to tokenize assets and currencies, the correspondent banking system no longer holds the keys to the kingdom. David Rudder from R3 is telling you that there is a fundamental change occurring. R3 has created private and permissioned platforms for the majority of large banks and central banks. He's in a position to know.
The good news is that the big banks are all ready. We know that. But the big banks are doing business with 11,000 other institutions around the world, which have a variety of different states of readiness. What I think most people are concerned about is the speed with which that long tail can really catch up with the implementation pattern of the big banks. Because it's really only when the entire community is using this new rich ISO 20022 data set that the full benefits of the transition can be secured by everybody to the same extent.
R3 has even created proof of concept with SWIFT. David says SWIFT will have a role, but not as a messaging layer that supports the current regime, the correspondent regime. ISO 20022 messaging allows common standards and interoperability between banks and fintechs. Every payment will be the same. Sometimes payments need to be converted by banks into other forms of payments. The crypto industry has created payment platforms that use blockchain technology that are ISO 20022 compliant. RippleNet, for example, uses blockchain, which is a more efficient technology to send the payments. When you pair ISO 20022 with a settlement rail like crypto or tokenized assets, you're able to bypass correspondence completely. And SWIFT.
Column there called synthetic retail CBDC, and for those of you who don't know what a stable coin is, a synthetic CBDC is a stable coin that's instead of being backed by commercial bank deposits or other low risk liquid assets, is backed by deposits at the central bank. And arguably, Alipay and WeChat Pay are synthetic retail CBDC because their reserves are held at the People's Bank of China. So that one, you could almost say that retail CBDC, synthetic retail CBDC, is already in the wild. And there's a few other countries that require their e-money providers to park their funds at the central bank. So those would be arguably synthetic retail CBDC. And you'll see I've got retail GovCoin. That's a name I've invented, but it's essentially, it looks almost like a CBDC, but it's issued directly by the government. And I know of only one instance of that right now, at least in the experimental phase. The Pacific island of Palau is contemplating, the government's contemplating issuing a stable coin backed by US dollars there, because their legal tender and unit of account is the US dollar. They don't have a central bank. Because of that, they don't need a central bank because they don't actually offer up their own currency. So the government's contemplating issuing a stable coin backed by presumably deposits at the Fed or with commercial banks. Obviously, with commercial banks, that wouldn't be what I would call a GovCoin. I think it needs to be backed by deposits at a central bank, the relevant central bank.
Palau is a small Indo-Pacific island that has a close relationship with the United States. Palau uses the US dollar, and they don't have a central bank of their own. Their plan is to have dollars on the XRP ledger called the synthetic CBDC. As John Cliff says, this wouldn't be a CBDC if commercial banks are involved. The Federal Reserve is going to have an account for Palau. The Fed and U.S. governmental agencies are involved with this. The money that gets issued on the XRP ledger is happening with U.S. regulators. Think about that. The Fed is interacting with the XRP ledger while Fed governors are out in the open bashing crypto assets in public speeches. The XRP ledger has real-world utility, and nobody's talking about it. Ashish Burla stated that they've been collaborating with the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, which both studied Ripple's blockchain solution to improve cross-border payments. The Fed is going to need to have some sort of exposure to the XRP ledger to issue Palau dollars, or at the very least work with the Palau government, which President Whips has stated that they closely work with U.S. regulators. Now, what's interesting about all of this is there has been a relationship with the Fed since 2017. Palau is moving forward, and the official stance from the Fed is crypto is a speculative asset class similar to gambling. Yet, this type of utility is never discussed.
I kind of divide it into, if I take crypto as a whole, and what's useful and what's potentially useful and what's useless.
Okay.
And I'll give you a headline of what's useless. In the end, a cryptocurrency is useless. In the end, it's useless. To be absolutely clear, the punchline, because it doesn't truly fulfill the roles of money, what it purports to do. And
they're often bad for the environment, by the way.
Well, they're bad
right?
for the environment, but I mean, that's one of many reasons.
Yeah.
But in the core, and one of the ways to think about this is when you have over time, we've had innovations in the monetary system. Banknotes was an innovation. Banking itself, so-called fractional reserve banking, was an innovation. That actually, because of people like Standard Chartered, 85% of money is private money. You create it when you make loans. But always what happens is that money is tied back 100% instantaneously to the central bank, to the risk-free money. But the whole point of crypto is not to be tied back. It is not stable. It does not work in the end, and that's why we see the collapse. On top of that, it isn't actually a proven ownership of the underlying asset. So crypto is, I'm afraid, in the useless camp, which is pretty big. But the technology, distributed ledger technology, useful.
Be clear, and again, this may be too techy, but there are roles for what are called native currencies in smart contract networks and some wholesale finance opportunities. And so you see a lot of activity around that based off of Ethereum or Ripple.
Carney says crypto is in the useless camp, but the underlying technology offers great promise. Currencies like XRP are native currencies to network that have great promise. There's all types of variations of blockchain technology, some without tokens, some with tokens. But the ones without tokens aren't global and they're not decentralized. The ones that are open and decentralized have currencies, like the XRP ledger. Now, these private permission systems that don't have tokens, they're not very useful. They're useful for certain things, but at the same time, for this to work on a global level, for this to work like the internet, there needs to be a public token.
Stable coins potentially useful, although, and I'm running out of time, we want central bank digital currencies to be at the heart of that. I think in the end will be more useful. The application, which last point, time up, which I think will be very useful for this group, is that what is possible through tokens, i.e. tokens of token value, is to have greater ownership of a much broader range of assets. So we all hear about NFTs, and a lot of focus is on the art world. Okay, you can make your own judgments about the values of those, but having fractional ownership of real estate, signature real estate here in Singapore, and being able to transact that costlessly and build out a portfolio accordingly as a consequence, and many other applications I think are there. That's where we'll ultimately head. I think we'll end up with a system, and the MAS is helping to lead this with central bank digital currency at the core, much cheaper cross-border transactions, much lower core role for the US dollar 10 years hence as a consequence of that, and then a much broader portfolio space for individuals. So your job's going to become that much more interesting, and that much more, and your opportunity set in the audience here and virtually is going to become that much greater. Some good will come.
Okay. Even if there's some useless element.
What Carney is saying is that traditional assets will be hosted on these open ledgers, and that's the great promise. It's not that we'll use Bitcoin like dollars, Real-world assets such as real estate will have unique properties like instantaneous settlement, fractionalization, and global. What I mean by global is I could send the asset to anyone with an internet connection. The networks with the most value and liquidity will be the most dominant networks, where there is a constant demand for the token because I can't move any of my assets or do anything unless I pay XRP or reserve XRP. XRP is also paired to every asset natively. It requires zero trust. If I purchase an ounce of gold from you, I need to trust you that you actually have the gold. I need to trust, where XRP doesn't have any counterparty risk. It's trustless.
We recognize that public blockchains have an important role to play in the future of finance. However, for regulated finance, you need both privacy and identity, which is built into the core layer of Corda. With public blockchain, neither exists and has to be added in what they call a layer 2 solution. I liken that to having you try to add a 60-story tower to the top of your 2-story house. It's not fundamentally designed to support it. However, we recognize that we need to interoperate and be able to connect to those systems in the future.
It's funny because R3's whole mission was to bring private and permission chains to institutions. Now we hear David Rutter saying that they need interoperability with public chains. And that goes back to what Matt Hamilton was saying about Swift not working because they didn't have a public chain. Not to mention R3 ran that proof of concept. And that's the conclusion they came to. But that's why private chains, they can't do everything, and David Rutter knows it. This is why we've seen a push from R3 to integrate public chains. And it's why I'm excited about federated sidechains. It's going to allow all these private chains to have any property that they want. They can be completely centralized, they can be completely private, but they can connect to the XRP ledger. Also, I want to mention that the XX network is a public chain, but at the same time it's private. It's open and transparent, so most cryptos are open and transparent, meaning I can go through it and see which wallet sent which coin to which wallet, but the XX network scrambles all that data, so it's impossible for me to track down the wallets and try to figure out where one coin went to another. It's still public and transparent, I just can't make any sense of the data. Not even quantum computers can make sense of the data. And what David Rutter is saying is that's a quality that's needed in traditional finance. Privacy chains have this stigma around them that they're, privacy is kind of this evil thing, but that's not true. And it's even true in traditional finance that in order to make transactions happen, there needs to be a layer of privacy in traditional finance. So there's real world applications for privacy. It's just often demonized and stigmatized.
I am less worried about the data central banks will have and more worried about the unregulated and undiscussed freedom that they would currently have to use that data for. So currently, there is no provision, no legislation, and no talk of upcoming regulation to prevent certain usages of that data in particular situations that could undermine freedom, choice, individuality, access to certain types of recreation or healthcare, and depending on the geography you're in and the demographic you belong to, this could have some very scary implications for freedom.
CBDCs have the potential to be a system of oppression. And that's why it's important that if we did have a central bank digital currency, that it would have a layer of privacy, not trust, but privacy. Privacy that's directly into the code, that's built directly into the code. WeChat can see everything a person does. That's a problem. If the US or any other country makes a CBDC, it's not good enough that we trust that they won't spy on our data. It has to be impossible for them to spy on our data.
One of the most interesting things that I'm seeing today in central bank digital currencies is the use of automated market making for foreign exchange. And what this could do is completely transform foreign exchange markets by using a particular type of structure that we take from decentralized finance and using that for central bank digital currencies, transferring the different currencies between each other. And this would, in part, help central banks to use their liquidity more effectively and also potentially do away with swap lines at central banks altogether.
I find it really interesting to see that the AMM is being proposed for the XRP ledger. Simultaneously, central banks are testing AMMs for their own. We know that central banks are using private versions of the XRP ledger, we just don't know how many. James Wallace, that heads the CBDC initiative at Ripple, said that they had at least a central bank from every continent, excluding Antarctica. So 6, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out if there are a lot more. SAMA, or the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, also partnered with Ripple. Saudi Arabia is starting to announce that they'll accept other currencies and other forms of value instead of dollars. Now, the partnership is interesting, not that I'd say that, everything's going to be XRP, but just being able to accept different currencies. How are they going to go about that? How are they going to do that? What's the mechanics behind it? Computer science is no more about computers than astronomy is about telescopes. Thanks everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon.